No one is coming to save you. No one is coming to make life right for you. No one is coming to solve your problems. If you don't do something, nothing is going to get better. Nathaniel Brandon. Have you ever caught yourself waiting for a specific phone call, hoping for that lucky break or just a shift that finally kickstarts your next chapter? We look at the horizon hoping that a mentor or a perfect opportunity will show up and handle all the heavy lifting for us. It's comforting to think that a backup plan is on the way. Things will finally start changing. But the reality is simpler and maybe a little more uncomfortable than we like to admit. No one is coming to save you. There's no rescue squad tracking your career, and there's no magic job offer floating your way to fix the tension in your life. You're it. You're the captain, the architect, and the execution team, all wrapped into one. And when you operate under the assumption that if you don't build the bridge, you'll simply stay stuck on the wrong side of the river, then everything changes. It's not about beating yourself up over past mistakes. It's about recognizing that the patterns that keep you waiting around instead of moving forward. However, the difficult part is that most of us aren't actually waiting for circumstances. We're waiting for relief, for someone to simplify the decision, to create that certainty, to reduce the risk and to move the discomfort. But there's a point where support turns into hoping someone else creates movement in a life that only you can move. And that realization might be the moment things finally start changing. There's an idea that seems to tag along anytime people talk about accountability or ownership. If you're responsible for your life, then you should do everything alone. Handle it all yourself. Figure it all out. Definitely don't ask for help. And don't lean on anyone. But that's not self-reliance. That's simply isolation pretending to be strength. The people who move forward consistently usually aren't doing everything by themselves. They're learning from people ahead of them and delegating where it makes sense. Additionally, they're reading, they're listening, they're adapting, and they use support when it's needed. The difference is they never hand over responsibility. That's the distinction. That's more important because it's easy to transfer ownership of your life without acknowledging it. You'll disguise the transfer by saying, once somebody gives me the opportunity, once somebody explains it better, once somebody believes in me, then I'll finally take action. But support is never supposed to become permission. On the other hand, it's not about ignoring reality either. Every one of us has responsibilities. We each have jobs, families, financial pressures, and limited time. Nobody's pretending those things don't exist. But the question isn't whether your circumstances are difficult. The question is whether you've started treating your circumstances like the decision maker. There's something uncomfortable about realizing nobody can want your goals more than you do. Nobody can build your habits. Nobody can make your career change. No one can improve your health, improve your relationships, or develop your character for you. Yes, people can help, and people should help. But your life still belongs to you. And once you stop expecting someone else to carry the ownership, you start realizing that you're never as stuck as you think. And once you separate self-reliance from isolation, you'll understand that there's a difference between receiving help and expecting rescue. Help strengthens your ability to move and achieve your goals. Rescue removes your need to move or grow. But that line is easy to miss because rescue rarely comes with a press release. Most of the time it appears that you're being reasonable. It's telling yourself you'll start after someone makes the first move. It's waiting to feel more confident before making the decision. Or it's believing you have to be motivated before you can take action. And it also has a way of showing up personally. You're always waiting for the perfect routine. You're hoping to have more energy. Or you need for there to be less stress. Now, None of those things are bad to want. But eventually there's a point where the expectations become something outside of you. And you need to create movement before you can do anything. That's where we get bogged down in the mud, because we've assigned responsibility to someone or something when the reality is that we should be carrying the load. However, there are aspects that are important to understand. Support works best when it multiplies action that already exists. Advice helps more when decisions are already being made. And opportunity matters more when preparation is already happening. But if nothing changes until someone shows up, then what you're really waiting for may not be help at all. You may be waiting to feel safe enough to begin. On the other hand, the difficult thing about waiting is that it rarely feels like waiting when you're inside of it. You'll tell yourself that I'm just thinking things through. I'm gathering more information. I'm making sure that I time it correctly. I'm ensuring that I'm going to avoid mistakes. And sometimes any of those can be the right move, because not every decision should be rushed. But there's a point where preparation stops creating readiness and starts creating distance. You keep researching and planning instead of acting. And because you're still mentally engaged with the goal, it feels like progress, not avoidance. That's what makes this pattern so easy to miss. The cost of waiting usually isn't obvious in the moment. It's cumulative. You stop trusting yourself to act without certainty. You become uncomfortable making decisions without complete information. You start believing conditions need to improve before action makes sense. And little by little, action becomes something reserved for when everything feels aligned. But life rarely, if ever, works that way. The most meaningful decisions are made with incomplete information. The most progress happens before we completely feel confident. And the most growth starts while parts of your life still feel inconvenient. But the longer you train yourself to wait for ideal conditions, the more normal waiting begins to feel. Then eventually you're no longer asking, is this the right time? And you're more frequently asking yourself, why does starting feel so difficult? Because repeated waiting slowly became your default setting. And defaults are powerful. But you rarely notice them until they're deciding for you. However, there's a moment that happens when you stop waiting. It's the moment you realize nobody is coming to remove the uncertainty. And if you're honest, that realization doesn't always feel empowering. At first, it can feel disappointing, because there's a part of all of us that wants someone to tell us we've done enough, that our intentions should count for more than they do, and that eventually life will reward our patience on its own. So then when ownership does come back into your control, it can feel heavier before it feels lighter. You have to understand and recognize that that's normal. But accountability gets misunderstood because we treat it like self-criticism. However, self-criticism tells you this is your fault, where accountability tells you this is still your responsibility. They're not the same thing. And responsibility isn't a punishment, it's power. Because the moment something becomes your responsibility again, your actions matter again. You stop spending energy wishing circumstances were different and start recognizing what's available to you right now. That shift changes the conversation. Instead of wondering, why hasn't somebody fixed this? You start asking, what's my next move? Instead of waiting to feel more ready, you get curious about what happens if you act before you feel ready. And that's where people often start feeling relief, because they stop standing outside their own life, waiting for permission to re-enter it. Now, one of the hardest things to notice about losing ownership is that it usually doesn't happen all at once. Most of us don't have an epiphany one day and decide to stop trying. It's usually slower than that. You put effort into something and it doesn't work. You make a change and nothing happens, at least not immediately. You do the responsible thing and no one recognizes it. Or you take a risk and it doesn't pay off. And after enough of these perceived letdowns, it's normal for a thought to creep in that feels justified. You'll ask yourself, what's the point? And yes, it's driven by emotion, because how we feel impacts many of our thoughts. But that's what makes it dangerous, because eventually you stop making choices and decisions you actually still have the ability to make. Because disappointment convinces you that action no longer matters. You can see it in others. When they stop applying themselves, they stop trying to improve themselves or their environment, they get stuck and stop trying new options for growth. Now, they don't always call it giving up. Sometimes they call it being realistic. But there's an important distinction. Recognizing limits is healthy. Assuming you no longer have influence when you still do is something different. Your life doesn't require certainty to respond to effort. It only requires effort to remain possible. But that doesn't mean every attempt works. It doesn't mean accountability guarantees outcomes. However, it does mean your responsibility is movement, not control. Because the opposite of no one is coming to save you isn't that you're alone. It's realizing you still have more influence than you've been giving yourself credit for. The goal is never to become somebody who needs nothing. The goal is to become somebody who keeps moving even when certainty hasn't arrived yet. Because if you wait long enough, life will always give you another reason to postpone something. You can believe that you always need more information, that there will be better situations or opportunities. You'll have more confidence, or there'll be less risk. And yes, sometimes those reasons will be correct for that instance. But there's a long-term cost to repeatedly handing tomorrow authority over today. Eventually, your trust in yourself slowly starts to disappear. Not the trust that everything will work, but the trust that you'll respond appropriately if it doesn't, that you'll adjust, that you'll learn, recover, and that you'll continue. This is about changing your standard. Not that you always know the answer, not that you never need support, not that every decision changes everything, just that you remain willing to decide and act without guarantees. There's a steadiness that comes when you operate that way. You don't expect life to become easier before you engage with it. You engage with it and become more capable because you did. So if there's something in your life that's been sitting in the waiting room, maybe it doesn't need a perfect plan. Maybe it doesn't need permission. Maybe it just needs someone willing to step forward before all the conditions feel right. Because the moment you accept that the rescue party isn't coming is also the moment you finally become free to choose your next move. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.